shoot manual film or instant cameras, you know how stressful it can be to guess exposure, especially when your camera's light meter isn't reliable. But could this little $45 Godox C100 actually help me get usable exposure? I use it as my light meter, not to take the photo, and I was pleasantly surprised by the results. But one photo isn't enough, so I used the C100 across a roll of Fujifilm 400, testing it in bright outdoor light, mixed lighting, and indoors. Plus, I also tried it with an instant camera. For testing, I took a reading with the Godox C100 and used that reading to update my exposure settings on my Pentax K1000. Also did some testing where I took a photo with the recommended settings from the Godox C100, and then I took essentially the same photo using the light meter built into the Pentax to see if there would be a major difference. As you can see, these two photos are pretty similar. The little $45 camera did a pretty good job of reading the exposure of this scene, at least for this photo. And that's an important distinction because I don't want to just test this in one easy situation, get one good photo, and then tell you that's a replacement for every light meter out there. The real question is, can this little $45 device help you get reliable exposures when you're shooting a manual camera and your built-in light meter is broken, missing, or difficult to trust? Before we get into the results, let's quickly talk about how this works. So the headline feature for this little camera is the transparent display. It's a see-through panel that overlays exposure information, framing guides, and battery information over whatever you're looking at. There's no rich screen, and there's no instant playback. As a camera, it's very basic. It's about 2 megapixels, and the image quality is really more toy camera quality than serious image quality. Godox kind of leans into that. They market this as being focused on fun. But again, I didn't buy it for the camera option. I bought it for the light meter. The C100 lets you manually set your ISO, your aperture, or your shutter speed. For the ISO, it has a range of 100 to 3200. It has an aperture range from f1.0 to f64. And the shutter speed ranges from 1/8000th of a second all the way down to 1 second. That'll cover the vast majority of film and instant stocks you'll likely use. The C100 uses center weighted metering on the central 25% of the frame. It also uses reflective metering, which just means it measures the light bouncing off the subject. That's different from incident metering, which measures the light falling onto a subject. So you do need to be intentional about where you point this light meter. If your subject is off center or you're dealing with a backlit scene, point the C100 directly at the part of the scene you want to expose properly. Lock in that reading, then recompose. That's the same general technique you would use with any center weighted light meter. Using the C100 is really easy. I didn't have to read any manuals or watch any YouTube videos to get it to work. First, push the power slider to the light meter icon. You should see the exposure triangle options across the bottom of the screen. You'll see the ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Set the ISO to match the film you're shooting with. Next, you can either change the shutter speed or the aperture, or just start with whatever the light meter starts with. One thing to note, the exposure setting with the outer box around it is the one that will automatically adjust when you meter. Point the C100 at your subject and press the shutter button. It will give you an exposure settings recommendation. You then take those numbers, dial them into your camera, and you're ready to shoot. For example, if the C100 gives me an ISO 400, f5.6, and a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second, I set those same values in my Pentax and I should have a properly exposed photo. If the C100 gives you settings that your camera cannot do, go back to the screen where you changed the ISO in the beginning and press the little circle button between the two arrows. You can then cycle through and change either the shutter speed or the aperture, and then re-meter your scene. Then the C100 will adjust the other settings. Keep tweaking the settings until you find the one that works for your camera. Now what about my instant photographers? If you own an instant camera with manual controls like the Polaroid I-2 or the Polaroid Flip, you have control over the aperture and the shutter speed. If for whatever reason the light meter becomes defective on one of these cameras, you'd have to guess exposure on film that costs more than $2 per shot, and no one wants to do that. To determine the exposure for your instant photos, you follow the same steps as metering the C100 for film. Make sure you adjust the ISO for the respective instant film you're using. So ISO 640 for Polaroid I-type or 600, and ISO 800 for Instax. As cool as this little device is, it's not perfect. One of my main complaints is that the screen is very fingerprint prone. I'm also a bit worried about how easily the transparent panel can get scratched. And although the display is easy enough to read in most situations, it can be harder to read when you have a really bright or really dark background. Those are small things, but they can matter when you're using this as a practical tool out in the field. If this kind of practical film test is useful to you, consider subscribing. And tell me in the comments, if your camera has a defective light meter or no light meter at all, how do you determine your exposure settings? So now let's look at some photos. I'm mostly going to show you comparison shots. I want you guys to try to guess which photos I use the Godox C100 and which ones I use the camera's built-in light meter. We'll also show you a couple of single shots. I took like one inside, and then I took one with kind of a more shaded area, just so you guys can kind of see and let me know what you think of how the light meter performed. All right, let's get started. All right, this one should be pretty easy. I've already showed you guys this one in the beginning, but in case you skipped around, take a second and guess which one is with the Godox and which one is with the camera's built-in light meter. Okay, so the one on the left is with the Godox and the one on the right is with the camera's built-in light meter. I actually prefer the one on the left, the Godox one here. I generally like my images to be a bit brighter. However, I do think the colors look a little bit richer on the photo on the right, which is a little bit darker. Okay, we have our next round of photos. Again, tell me which one you think is with the Godox and which one you think is with the built-in light meter. So the one on the left is with the Godox and the one on the right is with the camera's built-in light meter. The interesting thing about this set of photos, well, there's a couple of things actually. So one, you can see that the one on the left is slightly brighter than the one on the right. However, another thing I noticed is that the one on the right has a bluer tint than the one on the left. And I don't know if that's because of how much brighter the one on the left is. But I did think that was interesting that the one on the right has a cooler tone than the one on the left. And so the whites look a little cooler in the one on the right. A little bit more information about these photos. So for the one on the left, my settings were f11 with a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. Now the Godox C100 told me I should use a shutter speed of 1/800th of a second. And so I had to decide between 1/500th of a second and 1/1000th of a second, because that's where kind of 800 falls in the middle. So I ended up going with the 1/500th of a second because I normally like brighter images than, darker images. So that's why I went with the 1/500th of a second. But you do get to see what the 1/1000th of a second image would have looked like, because that's what it is on the right hand side. Those were the settings. I used the same f11, but the shutter speed I used 1/1000th of a second instead of the 1/500th. All right, so time for your next guess. Okay, so this time the one on the left was used with the camera's built-in light meter and the one on the right was used with the C100's light meter. And I think you're kind of starting to see a pattern here where the Godox C100 tends to favor a brighter image while the in-meter camera appears to be slightly darker. And I guess the question is, which one do you think is better exposed here? Me personally, I do think that the one on the left is better exposed than the one on the right. And I do feel like I'm being a bit contradictory here when I explain which one of these images I prefer. So I do prefer the image on the left, which does look darker than the image on the right. And I guess what I should have said was that I prefer images that are either, when I say brighter, I mean like the whites are brighter, or the colors overall are bolder and not super washed out. So while I don't think the C100 or the photo on the right is like super washed out, you can definitely see a difference in the saturation and boldness of the colors between the one on the left and the one on the right. But let me know, which one do you guys prefer more? All right, so this is going to be the last set of comparison shots. So here we go. Guess which one was with the Godox and which one was with the built-in light meter. Okay, so the one on the left was metered with the Godox C100 and the one on the right was metered with the camera's built-in light meter. I don't think it's as drastic here, but you can still see kind of a brightness difference between the two images. So the one on the left I think looks brighter than the one on the right. So for the one on the left, or the one metered with the C100, so the C100 initially recommended a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second. My Pentax doesn't shoot that, so I had to decide between 1/125th of a second and 1/250th of a second. So I ended up going with 1/125th of a second for the shutter speed, and I used an f-stop of f11. And for the one on the right, I metered at 1/250th of a second and f11. So one thing about the K1000's light meter is that the way you see it is based on a needle system. And so what that means is a needle moves up and down. So if the needle moves too far up, that means the camera thinks your image will be overexposed. And if it moves too far down, that means the camera thinks your photo will be underexposed. And so you want to kind of keep that needle right in the middle, and that's your camera's way of telling you that it thinks the image is properly exposed. Okay, so this next image is just what I consider an image of mixed light. So in kind of the top corner, you have the image or the subject kind of in shadow or in shade. In the bottom half, you have the image in a brighter light. I think the C100 did a pretty decent job of exposing for this image, just with the kind of conflicting lighting situation here. So I'm, pleasantly surprised by this. I wasn't sure if with the center metering, how it will respond to kind of the split lighting situation, but I am happy with it. So this next image is probably the most disappointing image for the shoot. And I only say that because it didn't turn out as good as I would have hoped it would have turned out. I think with the shade, because this was kind of backlit, you can kind of see the sun is somewhat high in the sky behind this building, but it's still kind of peeking through. So the image just kind of looks washed out and muddy, and it's just not my favorite image. I am curious, and I wish I would have done a comparison shot for this lighting situation here, because I am curious as to how the camera's built-in light meter would have metered this situation. Okay, and this is going to be the last of the 35mm film shots. I still want to share with you guys some of the instant photos I took. But yeah, I am pleasantly surprised by this image because this image was shot indoors and I was using a much lower shutter speed than I would normally use for like a digital camera. So I was very concerned about like camera shake, but I guess film is potentially more forgiving of camera shake. I definitely need to do some research on that. But overall, I'm really happy with how this image turned out as far as like the brightness and being able to see the image and the inside of this local coffee shop that has really good food and drinks. But yeah, like I said, super happy with this. Like the other image, I do wish I would have used the camera's built-in light meter as well, just to see how the two images would have compared. So maybe I have to go back and shoot this again to see how the camera's built-in light meter would have metered this shot. Hey, instant photographers, I didn't forget about you. I've got some comparison shots as well. So let me know what you guys think. Which one was shot using the C100 to meter, and which one was shot using the camera's built-in meter. Okay, so for these two images, the one on the left was used with the C100's meter, and the one on the right was used with the camera's built-in meter. So shooting with the Polaroid was interesting when I actually like stopped and looked at the settings, because for instance, say the photo on the left, the Godox recommended a f-stop of 11 and a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second. But the Polaroid recommended I shoot it at f/22 and a shutter speed of 1/40th of a second. So that's a big difference in shutter speeds. So yeah, as you can see, or at least I think you can see, the photo on the left is actually a bit darker, I think, than the photo on the right, which is interesting because from the 35mm shots, usually the darker, slightly bolder image is usually from the camera's built-in meter, and the brighter image is from the C100's meter, but in this instance, it seems to be reversed. Okay, so next set of photos, make your guesses. So for these sets of photos, the one on the left was shot using the camera's built-in light meter, and the one on the right was shot using the C100's built-in light meter. So with these two photos, you can see that the camera exposes a bit darker than the C100 does. And again, nothing wrong with that. I do prefer the image on the left because I think the image on the right, like the whites are too bright and almost blown out, and it's hard to see like the O and the E in the love, and you can see them a bit better in the one on the left. All right, this is going to be my last set of comparison shots for Polaroid. Make your guess. Okay, so the one on the left was shot using the C100 as the light meter, and the one on the right was shot using the camera's built-in light meter. So of these two images, I do prefer the one on the right. I like the bolder and richer colors. I am annoyed with myself that I forgot to account for the fact that the I-2's viewfinder is the skew of where the lens actually points. And so as you can see, I kind of cut off part of the greetings, or the G in the greetings, for the photo on the right. I don't think the photo on the left looks bad. I just prefer the bolder colors of the one on the right. Okay, so you've seen what this little light meter can do. Let's talk real quick about some of the specs. The C100 weighs about 65 grams, which is roughly the weight of 2 packs of instant mini film. The dimensions are approximately 6.35 inches by 4.4 inches by 1.2 inches. It's about the size of a deck of cards, so it's genuinely pretty pocketable. It charges over USB-C, and it has a micro SD card slot that supports up to 128GB cards, so you can take a lot of photos with this, and video. Godox says you get about an hour and a half of continuous shooting. In my own use, I spent about 2 hours metering on and off without really turning off the light meter in between, and the battery still showed about half-life remaining. I'm pretty happy with the battery life for this little device. Okay, so first, the wins. The ISO range from 100 to 3200 covers most film and instant stocks. The aperture range from f1 to f64 gives you plenty of flexibility. And the shutter speed ranges from 1/8000th of a second to 1 second, so that handles bright daylight, indoor scenes, and longer exposures. Second, the form factor. At 65 grams, it's so lightweight that you probably won't even notice the weight in your bag. It weighs less than most phones, and it slips easily into a camera bag or even a jacket pocket. And third is the price. At $45, it's one of the cheaper new light meters I've seen. You also get the camera and video features, even though I didn't really test them here. For someone who wants a reliable exposure reading without spending $100 or more on a light meter, this price is hard to ignore. Now let's talk some of the trade-offs. It's sensor weighted only and doesn't do incident metering. And because it's reflective metering, you need to think about the tone and brightness of the area you're measuring. Again, the transparent display can also be hard to read against really bright or really dark backgrounds. If you need incident metering or spot metering or some documented calibration standards, you need to look elsewhere. But for the price and the size, I think these are reasonable trade-offs, especially for beginners. Now, I will by no means consider this a professional light meter, but it can definitely get the job done in most basic situations. For film, if you've upgraded from a point and shoot to a camera with a broken or missing light meter, and you don't want to guess your exposure or break the bank, this is a $45 solution that works. For instant photography, if you have a camera that allows you to adjust the aperture or the shutter speed, and you don't trust the built-in metering in certain situations, this is also a good option. I would think of the C100 as a bridge. It can help you get mostly accurate exposures in most situations, while you save up for more advanced gear. Or if you mostly shoot in controlled lighting, or you're just generally happy with the results you get from this little device, it might be all you ever need. If you've picked up the Godox C100, or you're thinking about it, drop your experience in the comments below, or tell me why. I'd love to hear how other film and instant photographers are using this little device, especially with different film stocks and cameras. Also, if you've enjoyed this video and found it useful, please hit that subscribe button. It's an easy way to help my channel grow. Stay tuned for next week's video where I take this bad boy here and compare it to another budget 35mm film camera. Until next time, keep practicing, keep having fun, and I'll see you in the next video.